Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I now move the amendment circulated in my name. I rise to speak on the Scams Prevention Framework Bill 2024 and move the second reader's amendment circulated. This bill establishes a legislative framework to require designated sectors to prevent and respond to scams. The concept of a scams prevention framework is broadly supported in principle by all stakeholders, including the proposed regulated sectors, which would be banks, telcos and digital platforms. Actions on scams is also something the Coalition supports. Scam losses have increased exponentially in recent years, with losses reported of $2.7 billion for Australian consumers in 2023. The latest ACCC data also suggests scam losses have started trending up again since May. That is a huge amount stolen from Australians, often by overseas criminals, and it destroys lives, it destroys families. I know there are even people in this place, members of parliament or senators, who have themselves been victims of scams. So Australians must be vigilant. But scams are becoming more sophisticated, and we agree there must be a minimum standard in place and a consistent approach to how banks, telcos and digital platforms act. The Coalition has acted in good faith and waited patiently for the government to bring this forward. We have not politicised it or drawn attention to the delays. Unfortunately, the legislation served up for us today is rushed and half-finished, and another example of the government's legislating these priorities to the last minute. The most important protections are still yet to be drafted, and it's looking impossible for the full framework to be operational before an election is called. The Albanese government promised sector-specific mandatory codes, but has not delivered them. The Albanese government promised a simple redress mechanism for consumers, but has not delivered it. And delivering the best model to protect Australians from scams should have come ahead of the minister's attempt to save face by rushing this bill into parliament. Now, I'll say that there are features of the design that we do agree with. First, the whole of ecosystem approach is supported. The scam attack chain is complex, and focusing on where there is the most risk across banks, telcos and digital platforms is a sensible idea. Second, while consumers should have simple access to redress, I agree a mandatory or automatic reimbursement model is not the right approach. The proposed 3-year statutory review will provide a good opportunity to assess whether this model is working, and also something we strongly support. I commend the Minister for bringing legislation to Parliament on this issue today, even if we believe it's a bit late. This is something that the Minister clearly cares about. We've had 14 media releases from the Minister on scams just this calendar year, a press club address where it seemed like this legislation was going to be released, but unfortunately it took another 3 months to surface. And you could describe the Minister as a single-issue minister in the sense that, with his singular focus on this at the expense of broader portfolio responsibilities, there has been a lot of talk, but not a lot actually come through the parliament, as Australians have been left waiting for too long for the Albanese government to follow through on many of the announcements on scams. This was an election commitment from the Albanese government. It's unfortunate that after taking 28 months in government to get their act together, this has now been done in a rushed, half-finished and last-minute manner. For something that is often spoken about by the government and the Minister as a top priority, it hasn't necessarily been treated that way. This delay serves as an example of the government's legislative priorities that aren't often clear, of deprioritisation of Treasury portfolio legislation under the Minister's watch. While this legislation has finally made it here into the House of Reps today, the same can't be said for many of the other priorities in financial services. And time is running out. The runway for new legislation has likely already closed, given there'll be an election next year. Items like Tranche 2 of the Levy financial advice reforms has been left too late and is at risk of falling apart. A licensing framework for payment service providers, stored value facilities and stablecoins is nowhere to be seen. A licensing framework for digital assets platforms seem to have been abandoned, and ASIC is making policy via litigation. Buy now, pay later regulation remains stranded in the Senate, leaving CDR, consumer data right legislation, to languish in parliament for almost 2 years, and the financial services regulatory grid has completely stalled. Now, the Albanese government is more focused on announcements and follow-through, and we've seen it more and more recently with the government's plan for a plan and thought bubble policy announcements completely lacking in detail, dominating rather than delivering on its initiatives that they promised prior to the last election. We're now 2.5 years late. This process has been sloppy, and it serves as an example of the direction that this government is going in. They are already more focused on starting their election campaigning for May next year. We've seen it from ministers here during question time, rather than actually governing and getting some of the items through that I mentioned. The government does need to wake up. You're in government, and the election's not until May next year. An announcement is different from follow-through. The work still needs to be done. There are good intentions with this bill, intentions the opposition supports, but good intentions don't always equal good policy making or good legislation. The consultation on this legislation has been unnecessarily rushed, and as I've already said, the government took 28 months to come up with this and then ran a shortened 3-week consultation period on the draft legislation. The bill was then turned around for introduction 4 weeks later, with little of the consultation feedback incorporated as a result. This is complex legislation. These aren't minor amendments without a regulatory burden that can be rammed through without scrutiny. Every stakeholder I talk to is disappointed by the slash-dash approach. And it's no surprise when a recent Freedom of Information release revealed the government gave special treatment to the banks, particularly to the ABA, to conduct special hothouse targeted consultation sessions. Other regulated sectors claim this opportunity was not afforded to them, and aspects of the final design were a surprise. Now, I don't begrudge the banks for this. They have every right to have input and argue for their interests. But it is the government's responsibility to ensure there is proper, meaningful consultation and that all of the sectors that face significant penalties for breaching this scheme have at least some input. And I'm seriously concerned about the impact of the secretive approach to consultation the Albanese government has made the norm, particularly over the last 12 months. We are seeing this again with the development of the second tranche of Levy financial advice reforms. The government has started up another hothouse with selected stakeholders in secret, all bound by non-disclosure agreements. And as we have seen with this scams legislation, I'm sure that the government will again lob draft legislation on financial advice reforms out for another shortened consultation period and ignore the majority of the advice community that has been excluded. And then the government will again wonder why nobody is standing with them to endorse it. Now, although the government truncated consultation and some stakeholders couldn't even make a submission in the time provided, the feedback that was provided was critical. The bill has been described as rushed, heavy-handed, complex, unclear and stacked against consumers. For context, I note the bill has 3 key aspects. 1, enforceable principles-based obligations in the primary legislation which apply to each sector once designated, with the ACCC as a responsible regulator. 2, a regulation-making power for the minister to designate sectors and regulators. And 3, a regulation-making power for the minister to make mandatory sector-specific codes with prescriptive obligations. So once this legislation is enacted, the government will then have to consult on and make sector designation instruments and the mandatory codes. Despite being Minister Jones's top priority, this bill has been left to the last 6 months of the term at best and is unlikely to be fully operational before an election. These delays haven't been caused by the opposition. It hasn't been the Liberal National Party that has caused these delays. We've been given just a week before debate has resumed. A significant amount of stakeholder feedback has focused on the uncertainty created by the use of broad overarching obligations in the primary legislation which require taking reasonable steps. At previous stages of consultation, the government's focus was on prescriptive obligations contained in sector-specific mandatory codes which clearly outline the practical minimum standards expected for each sector. With these codes still yet to be developed, the government has instead created these principle-based obligations with significant civil penalties attached in the primary legislation, which I assume will eventually be supplemented by codes. The regulator sectors say it is difficult to understand how these obligations will be interpreted.
I thank the honourable assistant minister.
In continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The regulator sectors say it is difficult to understand how these obligations will be interpreted by the regulator or by AFCA when consumer redress claims are made. This is particularly difficult with the prescriptive content of the codes that will sit alongside and inform these principles still unknown. The Customer-Owned Banking Association, COBA, summed these concerns up well, saying, "The complexity of these obligations evidences why the codes must be created before designation, as key details on how to comply with the principles will be within these codes, without which our members will lack clarity in how to meet their obligations under the framework." Stakeholders have also raised significant concerns about the risks of being compliant with a mandatory code but still in breach of a primary legislation principle. On this point, the ABA has said in some cases there is no assurance that these requirements would effectively reduce scams, and the breadth of certain terms and compliance requirements may create uncertainty that could hinder large-scale investment aimed at preventing and detecting scams. To address this issue, some stakeholders have encouraged greater use of the targeted codes, with the primary legislation being focused on enabling the framework rather than it being a pseudo-code containing its own potentially conflicting obligations. It seems like the government hasn't been able to get all the work done and has resorted to this stopgap approach so that it can look like it's delivered on its commitment. On this point, I also question why the government has not been able to bring forward and consult on the designations and codes alongside the primary legislation. It took almost 18 months to even put forward a model for scams prevention, 2.5 years to finally bring forward legislation, and it's not even enacting the full framework, it's just enabling legislation. The framework relies heavily on delegated legislation, but everyone has been expected to wade this bill through and hope for the best. Significant detail is missing. The government managed to do this when it brought forward the Buy Now, Pay Later legislation. It still hasn't passed, but the regulations were available for consultation before introduction. I wonder if this wasn't possible because the work simply hasn't been done in 2.5 years. Where are the mandatory codes? There is already a code-making power in the Competition and Consumer Act for the government to prescribe mandatory industry codes. These existing codes include the Franchising Code of Conduct, the Unit Pricing Code and the Dairy Code of Conduct. The minister could have already have mandatory scams codes in place with this Act. Instead, his choice to over-engineer for the sake of having a bill, to wave around in Parliament and squeeze another announcement out as delayed action. That's the concern here. The minister himself admits he doesn't get given enough drafting resources, but he's still decided to use the most drafting-intensive, slowest approach to making these codes. This process has been back to front and consumers have waited too long as a result. Even more bizarre is the regulation impact analysis that has been tabled with the explanatory memorandum. According to the government's explanatory materials, regulatory compliance costs of around $228.8 million in the initial year of operation and $88 million for each year ongoing. However, this compliance burden appears to be grossly underestimated based on some of the costing assumptions that have been used. Here are a few of the strangest. 1.1 full-time equivalent staff required for a major bank to uplift anti-scam activity and government's improvements. I was talking to a guy from ANZ today who told me they currently have 400 full-time people in scams. You know, the bank with the little hawk or the eagle on the ads? 1.1 full-time equivalent staff with this legislation? I mean, come on. A $40,000 initial technology investment required for a major bank to comply with the info sharing and reporting obligations, and $20,000 ongoing. Okay. A $40,000 initial investment in staff for a COBA member bank, a smaller bank, to administer anti-scam activity and governance improvements, and $10,000 ongoing. A $100,000 initial investment for a major telco to uplift anti-scam activity and governance, and $50,000 ongoing. When the Assistant Treasurer spoke at the Press Club, he said that this framework will not be the bare minimum. Well, based on these assumptions, it looks a lot like the bare minimum to me. A short conversation with any regulated entity would debunk these assumptions immediately. Either the government expects minimal uplift and investment from these regulated entities, or it is cooking the books by understating what the real compliance costs will be. And I only mention this because we all know when there's compliance costs in place, it all gets passed on to every user. This isn't just an oversight. This is a document signed off by the Minister and tabled in Parliament with the explanatory memorandum. Impact analysis is important, and an accurate estimate of regulatory costs guides the Parliament's consideration of legislation. These are ultimately costs that get passed on to consumers, as I said a moment ago. I hope that the Office of Impact Analysis does not sign off on this document as compliant without first 100% checking this. The Minister and his department should go back and come up with the costings that have accuracy and issue a replacement explanatory memorandum. Feedback from both industry and consumer advocates points to the complexity arising from the lack of clear liability rules and an apportionment mechanism for situations where multiple entities across different sectors are involved in a scam. Uncertainty about liability and apportionment is likely to create a chain of suing and counter-suing between entities to apportion liability for consumer redress. This could result in confusion and delays for consumers seeking redress who will typically not have full visibility of the scam attack chain and the reasonable steps undertaken by each entity. While AFCA will be designated as a single door for external dispute resolution, stakeholders expressed concerns about how their decisions would work in practice and whether it would be creating an expensive and convoluted process without an improvement in consumer redress. Under the proposed model, there could be a protracted examination through an external dispute resolution body of different companies' relative roles in the scammer's attack to determine possible redress. Some stakeholders speculate this could take years to resolve and for consumers to be reimbursed because of the complexity of the scam attack chain. I understand changes have been made to the final bill to allow for rules or guidelines to be made around ensuring consumers have sufficient information to make it compliant and how liability should be apportioned. However, again, significant matters have been left to be dealt with in a delegated legislation which is yet to materialise. As key aspects of how this framework will operate, this information should be available alongside the bill. Under the bill, entities face serious penalties if they do not report all actionable scam intelligence to the ACCC. The broad definition used for scams intelligence means this reporting obligation could inundate the ACCC with an unprecedented volume of reports about scams without a clear mandate for what they will do with it. For example, publishing it or sharing it with regulated entities. Stakeholders have said this obligation will create a significant compliance burden and potential privacy issues without a clear connection to scam prevention or reducing consumer harm. On this issue, the Customer-Owned Bank Association has said that it is concerned with the legislation's complexity and the regulatory burden that could be created, especially for smaller banks, particularly the various reporting obligations, they say. As it stands, there is the potential to lead to a regime focused too much on reporting rather than protecting customers from scams. I appreciate changes have been made to the final bill to attempt to address the breadth of the reporting obligations, but As it has only been a week since this bill appeared, it's difficult for stakeholders to advise whether it will make a meaningful difference to the compliance burden. Stakeholders recommend the ACCC share a more manageable set of actionable reports with the National Anti-Scam Centre to use that information to develop a public, searchable database of known scams that consumers and companies can use to investigate whether something is a scam in real time. $44 million has already been allocated to the National Anti-Scam Centre in the federal budget for a technology build. This spend is vague, and I hope it has been used towards this kind of initiative. I also note the good work of the bank's existing information sharing initiative, the Australian Financial Crimes Exchange, or AFCX, which already facilitates the secure sharing of scam and fraud intelligence between banks. It is important the reporting obligations do not unnecessarily duplicate industry-led initiatives like this. Under this bill, regulated entities face significant maximum civil penalties because the penalties regime has been aligned with the existing penalties regime in the CCA for serious competition law offences. I note that some stakeholders argue this is disproportionate and the civil penalty regime should be restricted to apply only to serious breaches, or there should be a clear list of matters which can attract a pecuniary penalty. The severity of potential penalties compounds the broader concerns about the vague principles-based obligations in the primary legislation, serving as standalone obligations rather than being guiding principles for future mandatory codes. The current design of the framework and the potentially disproportionate penalty regime increases the risk of regulated entities being more focused on compliance and minimising potential liability rather than acting quickly and flexibly to address emerging scams or provide consumer redress. On this point, the Business Council of Australia said the proposed legislation is rushed, heavy-handed, complex and unclear. It is a prescriptive approach that reflects a compliance mindset rather than seeking to improve practical approaches to stopping scams. The Communications Alliance said telcos are subject to as many 4 concurrent enforcement mechanisms and could face penalties even when they comply with sector-specific codes, creating a quadruple jeopardy of liability. I am also concerned the broad operation of the framework and the disrupt principle in particular could have a chilling effect on the seamless digital experiences consumers have come to expect from their digital banking and digital platforms. For examples, delays and blocks to payments, freezing of accounts, additional verification processes and mandatory scam questionnaires are likely to become commonplace frictions. While these could be a valid, reasonable steps to prevent a scam, they will also create a broad inconvenience and frustration for many Australians. I note that the final bill now includes a safe harbour protection from liability in relation to losses incurred because of disruption activity. However, the inclusion of this acknowledges that consumers and businesses will inevitably be disrupted in a way that could cause them losses. There is also a risk it will exacerbate the existing issue of debanking, which has worsened under this government and could be used to restrict banking services unnecessarily. Unfortunately, the government doesn't have a great track record with compensation schemes. The compensation scheme of last resort serves as a cautionary tale of good intentions gone wrong because it became a mess under the Albanese government's watch, with costs blowing out due to the design of the scheme and excessive administration costs. The CSLR recently admitted the 2025 levy will likely exceed the $20 million subsector cap for financial advice. It was originally supposed to be $10 million. This means financial advisors are set to be slugged with an even bigger levy than this year. This scam scheme includes similar cost recovery elements and an underestimation of the compliance costs as I outlined before. But I hope we don't end up with a similar mess that needs to be mopped up because it has been rushed through with minimal consultation or scrutiny. I hope this won't be a CSLR 2.0. I also note that this framework relies heavily on leaving matters to be determined in future delegated legislation. Now, I must warn that giving this minister broad regulation-making powers is risky when you look at what recently happened with accountants and bookkeepers. They know this more than anyone after the minister was given powers to unilaterally vary their tax agent's code of conduct. There was massive pushback right around the country from these people, some of the most trusted people that there are, particularly for small and family businesses and sole traders. This minister made a determination which was widely criticised through a grassroots advocacy campaign and a united call for it to be scrapped from the leading accounting professional bodies. I won't talk too much more about that. I hope the minister has learned from this experience and does not use the same approach when making the many designations, codes and rules required for this scams prevention framework to be fully operational. The regulated sectors must put a lot of faith in the minister to get this right, and I hope this isn't another example of regulation by decree with no notice or consultation. The looming election should not mean that the designations and codes are also rushed and not properly consulted on, like this bill. The success of this framework will depend on these mandatory codes being well designed and effective. As I mentioned earlier, a whole-of-ecosystem approach makes sense. The scam attack chain involves different sectors, and a coordinated approach is important as scam attempts become more sophisticated. However, the government's scams policy does nothing to address the law and order issues associated with scams. Scams are typically perpetrated by transnational criminals, and Australia is viewed as a honeypot for these criminals. Fighting scams can't be left to banks, telcos and digital platforms. Other countries take these criminals on. That's very important, and that's something that we should be doing too. The policy response to scams cuts across multiple portfolios and isn't something that Minister Jones or even myself as opposition shadow can tackle just from the Treasury portfolio. It means that ministers need to be talking to one another and getting their departments involved, which doesn't always happen in this place. I'd also like to briefly mention the unclear role of the National Anti-Scam Centre. Despite pouring millions of dollars of funding into the National Anti-Scam Centre, it has zero mention in this bill and seems to play no part. It isn't very clear how this funding is being used by the ACCC. Education and advertising on scams should be a key focus for this spend. I also note that the National Anti-Scam Centre has not published a quarterly scams report for the last 2 quarters since May. Scams reporting data buried on the ACCC website indicates that between May and September this year, scam losses have started trending back up. So I must ask, why is the minister taking credit for a downward trend in losses 2023, but this spike hides this spike over the last 6 months? Why, with the huge additional resources provided to it, is the National Anti-Scam Centre not publishing quarterly scams reports for this period, yet this bill makes, of course, banks, telcos, digital providers report straight away? In conclusion, I have said before, if there are sensible reforms which will help during Labor's cost of living crisis and doing business crisis, we want to see them come into parliament and legislated as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the list of promised reforms in the Treasury portfolio, which are running out of runway before an election, has ballooned. Even the minister's top priorities, like this, are being left to the last minute, with rushed consultation processes and unexplained delays becoming the norm. The department and drafting resources are constantly scapegoated by this government, but it's becoming clear there is a lack of direction and leadership from the top. Unfortunately, the Albanese government's approach to legislating its scams prevention policy has been slapdash, half-finished and left to the last minute. The theatrics we saw yesterday in question time from the Assistant Treasurer show us that this government is running out of time. And a minister, he should be a little bit embarrassed that this has been left, this work, too late. Something as important as this should not be rammed through without scrutiny because the government can't manage its legislative agenda or has prioritised other things. The bill was panned during consultation and the many concerns raised, so many that I couldn't cover them all today, have not been fully addressed. The Assistant Treasurer's take-or-leave-it approach on this bill are disappointing. I want to assure stakeholders this bill can't get any worse, it can only get better. I hope that through a committee inquiry process there will finally be proper and meaningful consultation on this bill. All stakeholders will have their voices heard and that this bill can be improved and legislated.
Is the amendment seconded?